Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Can you still say morning? Good morning? I think so. Bonjour, mesdames et messieurs. Je m'appelle John Packer. Je suis le directeur du Centre de recherche et d'enseignement de droits de la personne ici à l'Université d'Ottawa. My name is John Packer. I'm the director of the Human Rights Research and Education Center here at the University of Ottawa. It's my pleasure to welcome everyone here. Today, this is a collaborative effort through three of the centers here at the University of Ottawa Faculty of Law. Please come on in. We're just starting. Of the health law and health law policy and ethics center. I always want to call it health, but HLPP, right?
That's right. I can't remember yours either.
No, yeah, also, which is difficult. HRREC. And the Law and Technology Center here in the Faculty of Law. We're delighted, especially to have someone we admire greatly, Senator McPhedran, who's just arrived, who's going to moderate this session with us. I'll introduce her in just a moment. The topic is obviously one of considerable immediate interest. I don't know if any of you watched this morning the direct statement from the Director General of WHO out of Geneva, who announced that it's not yet a pandemic, but it's really verging on becoming a pandemic and may well become one imminently. And of course, the great concern has been particularly not only the character of the way in which it's been spreading, but the high death rates, which I think is something like near 3% in China. We'll learn more about the details in a moment. The title of this meeting today is Coronavirus, or COVID-19 as it's now properly identified, Human Rights, Social Media, Balancing Rights and Responses in an Outbreak. We call it certainly an outbreak. Obviously, there's considerable concern as now this is, I forget the number of countries mentioned this morning, but spreading rapidly. Senator McPhedran, do you want to come and join us here? Yeah, no, please. I'm just welcoming. I'm just so, and I'm going to now actually introduce you.
Okay.
So please, it's a special pleasure for me to be able to introduce Senator McPhedran. We're both from Manitoba, so welcome to Manitoba's weather, by the way. We're totally comfortable, right? It's a little warm. Yeah. Exactly. For all of those who are, I'm really disappointed that the canal, the skating is over, but we are deeply disappointed by that. Some of you might not be, but Senator McPhedran is well known in the human rights community in Canada and internationally. She has a stellar pedigree in terms of her background to be here. She's particularly well known across Canada and beyond for her work on women's human rights. She's been a co-founder of a number of organizations, not least the Women's Rights Project, also the Global College at University of Winnipeg. So her vision has always been not just about human rights in Canada, but beyond. She's very well known in Canada for her work as a co-founder of the Women's Legal Education and Action Fund, which has sponsored an enormous number of important legal actions in Canada to advance equal rights to women in the country. She's been active for decades at the United Nations level. We won't go how many decades, but decades. She's a teacher, a lecturer, and an inspiring figure for many people. And I was personally overjoyed when she was appointed as a senator in 2016, I think it was, which I thought was a really enlightened appointment. And since she's been there, I think many of us have seen how she's contributed to changing the way the Senate, our old upper house, rather sedate place, has become less sedate, if I may say, since you've been there, and mobilized a group of other senators to improve governance in Canada and particularly the parliamentary element. So she agreed to moderate this session, and notwithstanding many travels and other things pressing upon her, she's fitted in, so we're thrilled that you're here. And without any further comment, I'll introduce, welcome Senator McPherson.
Thank you very much, Professor Packer, and thank you, Professor Flood, for the invitation. I'm really delighted to be here with you today. Just 2 days ago, I ended up in the basement of the World Health Organization headquarters in the SHOC, what's called the SHOC room, the Strategic Health Operations Center, for a briefing with the senior staff that are doing 24/7 right now on COVID-19. And we had to commit, I was there with a group of other parliamentarians and who were there for an advisory group that the WHO was hosting. And this just kind of popped out of our agenda. I had no idea that this was going to end up. So I thought, oh my goodness, this is quite the connection to getting back here and then being with you today for this panel. Pour commencer, je voudrais rendre hommage au peuple algonquin, gardien traditionnel de ce territoire qui est toujours non cédé. And this event, as I think has already been outlined, so I won't repeat the collaboration, which is also a really important part, I think, of when we make progress. It's very often when we find a way to work together. I'm very honored to be here with the panelists, and I'm not going to take a lot of your time in making the introduction, but I do want to note that this is not only a very timely topic, but it also has woven within it issues that it was really clear to me at WHO when I was there. There are no easy answers here. There is not a set formula, although there certainly clearly are protocols. So being able to have this discussion with Drs. Amir Attaran, Jane Bailey, YY Chen, Professor Flood, Vanessa Grubin, taking on this topic of balancing human rights and governmental response. We've talked about it informally among ourselves as potentially a pandemic. Clearly, we know that even as of today, because every day Dr. Tedros of the WHO gives a briefing at 4 o'clock Geneva time to the media. So that has happened just in the last hour or so. Anything we can find on Google indicates, again, he did not declare this a pandemic. But I think it's reasonable to anticipate, and it certainly was my intuitive sense in the meeting that we had, that the numbers are going up. And now we see situations where there isn't an obvious explanation for why someone has this. When I got off the plane from Geneva yesterday, I have to tell you, I have a cold. And I've had it for weeks, and I thought, oh my goodness, am I going to get pulled over? You know, I tried really hard not to cough as I was in the lineup, because people everywhere are on the alert. And, you know, people are being, those who work in the healthcare field are being disinvited to social functions, precisely because they do work in healthcare. I mean, there's a lot that happens to us at a time like this. And so what I would like to do is just ask our panel to begin. And I do want to warn folks that I am a bit of a time fascist. And one of the reasons for that is because I think we all agree we don't want to steal the time from the audience to have a chance either to be some discussion. So without any more words from me, may I ask President Flood, please?
Thank you. Thank you everyone for coming out on such a big snow day. We believe in food, and food is coming. So we will have to take a break at some juncture to allow ourselves to replenish. So I'm going to get the conversation rolling about human rights in the context of response to a potential pandemic and the COVID-19 outbreak. And I'm going to make 3 quick points. The first is that our public health laws are grounded in criminal law and police powers. And because of that, I think it sets up an inherent tension with human rights. The second is a problem of evidence, and that public health officials have to act in real time, often with very little evidence. And if they are successful, we never really know about it. And if they make a mistake or things go wrong, we're going to want their heads on a plate. The third is that social media, I think, can undermine governmental or public health decision making, and that 2020 public health requires not only the management of the outbreak, but management of panic and misinformation on social media. So human rights can impact in a variety of ways at the time of an infectious disease outbreak or a pandemic, and in very profound ways. And the most clear example of this comes from the requirement for quarantine, where obviously this restricts one's liberty, freedom to work, family life. And with COVID-19, we've seen the largest attempt at quarantine in the history of the world, where China locking down the city of Wuhan and neighboring cities quarantining some 18 million people. In some circumstances, quarantine may further endanger an individual by exposing them to food shortages, to inadequate access to medications and healthcare, and even an increased possibility of contamination from the very disease that you're trying to be quarantined about, as has happened, it seems, on the Diamond Princess cruise liner, where the quarantine seems to have significantly heightened the risk for passengers of exposure. So my first point is that public health is grounded in criminal law powers, and so the application of public health law can frequently be viewed as a conflict between public health goals, that is the reduction of the outbreak or spread of the contagion, and individual human rights. So it's often set up as that paradigm. That's certainly how I kind of approach it when I teach it. So for example, Section 15.3 of the Federal Quarantine Act requires that any traveller must comply with any reasonable measure ordered by a screening officer or quarantine officer. And they must report if they have reasonable grounds to believe that they might have come into contact with someone who's been exposed. So that's an obligation on the individual. And the Quarantine Act contemplates very severe penalties if you don't comply, up to $1 million in fines and up to 3 years in jail. Right? Now, I think people are sometimes a little bit surprised to hear how public law is really grounded in criminal law and police powers, but this is an old thing. And back in the day, actually, public health officers used to look just like policemen or women, right? They were dressed up in a uniform and they exercised those powers, which when you think about it, they're really like imprisonment, right, to some extent. And you also see why this has currency across political divides in time and space, because even libertarians agree that this is a role for the government, right? That using police powers, particularly against public health contagion, this is in a very kind of narrow view of the world of what the state should do. This is a role for the state. So now the use of criminal law powers has definitely softened vis-a-vis public health in Canada post-charter. And I think post an understanding that that often they can backfire. So having criminal sanctions or travel bans can result in unintended consequences where people actually try to avoid, as perhaps you did, admitting that they had a cold, right? Or because they're worried about the consequences, right? And sometimes these consequences can be severe if you are then made to lose your job, or you're not able to look after your ill or ailing family members, and all sorts of things like this. So there's been a much more of a softening of public health approach and more of a holistic view about the consequences, more of acknowledgement of the need for social justice and poverty issues and all of these sorts of things to be taken into account. But I fear that in the context of what may be an actual pandemic, that a lot of this is going to go out the window, because the population will be calling for quick and immediate action. Do something, do it now. And Mr. President, he who should not be named, and other people who don't believe in science will want to be seen to be doing something, even if it's the wrong thing. Right, so I think that's an issue that we're going to have to probably deal with. My second point is about evidence and knowing in real time what is in fact in the public interest. With COVID-19, there are many unknowns, and public health officials are hoping to make the right choices, right, to stave off or reduce morbidity, reduce mortality as much as they possibly can. But these choices may not always be right with hindsight, because in the moment they do not have all the information they need, as you said. It's very, very complex. And most public health actors, I think, are unsung heroes, right? Because we don't know the names and faces of the people that they save by taking the right steps at the right time. But of course, any mistakes will be punished fiercely, right? Whether these choices are viewed in hindsight as being under or overprotective of public health and the resulting impact on human rights, the economy, and so on. And I think in the world of public health, nowhere is it more true that victory has 100 fathers and defeat is an orphan. So my third and final point, I've got 1 minute.
Yes, you've actually got 1 minute and 42 seconds.
Fantastic. That's what I've got left to do. So, public health, public health, traditionally grounded in criminal law and command and control responses, rely on public trust and compliance, right? That's assumed. And of course, when that trust is not warranted and governments are deliberately suppressing news of outbreaks for fear of economic or other impacts, then social media is actually an essential tool of democratic communication for public health. Right? We need that. We had this problem with SARS. We're not having as much problem knowing about things this time because of social media. So that's the upside. But so for public health officials, trust has to be demonstrably earned and can't be assumed now. And managing this pandemic means managing social media. That is as much of the job of public health officials as managing the outbreak itself. For the panic, the side effects, if you like, of the pandemic are economic chaos, human rights abuses in terms of racial slurs and attacks, and other effects. Now, this isn't innate in the job of public health officials, right? We don't send them to journalism school and communication school. And so to assume that they're going to be able to do all of this and manage a pandemic, in my view, is ridiculous. And so let me just end with this, that we need to invest in this aspect of managing this pandemic as much as we invest in managing the disease itself in order for us to avoid the ill effects that come along with any of these sorts of outbreaks and possible pandemics. And I just want to close at this time we have, just putting the sort of panic in perspective, that we have 80,000 people who've been infected with close to 3,000 deaths. Most of them are in Hubei, but it has spread to other places. We should remember that that's about 3,000 deaths total. Every day, 3,000 people die in automobile accidents around the world. And many of them are young people. Every day. And we get out every day and drive the car and go around the place. Now, that's not to negate the importance of dealing with this pandemic, but it's just to put it a little bit in perspective.
Thank you. Perfect timing. So as many people in the room know, we have just heard from Professor Flood, who also is a university research chair in health law and policy. I'm hoping, did we hand out bios?
We did.
Okay,
So
so
then we
then
don't need to worry.
please do make reference to the considerable accomplishments that are attached to the bio sketch that you have. And may I now welcome our second panelist, Dr. Amir Ataran, professor in the faculties of law and medicine at the University of Ottawa here, and also holding a Canada Research Chair in law, population health.
Expired. And would the university finally get the memo that it's
Oh,
expired?
all right. But you haven't expired. So that's good. We have you with us.
COVID-19 gives me a chance.
Yeah. Please.
Thank you. I want to say some comments of a scientific nature and then some of a policy nature. When you start with science, because my initial training before I became a lawyer was my PhD is in cell biology and immunology of infectious disease, and I worked on that for a number of years. I've been on WHO expert committees as an expert, so designated and dubbed. I've been invited to participate in emergency committees of the kind that are making decisions about COVID now. First, the epidemiology. It's really very simple what we need to do, and I reject the thought that it's complicated. Here is what we need to do. The epidemic is following a curve. It starts small, it grows big over time, and it ends small once people have acquired immunity. That's typical. You have a choice though. Do you want a curve that looks like this with a sharp, quick peak and then dropping off? Or do you want a curve that looks like this, that's longer with a lower peak? In other words, this or this. Clearly you want the one with the lower peak that lasts longer. Why? Two scientific reasons. One, having a lower peak means a smaller surge of cases that strains the healthcare system. You're not dealing with a massive peak up here. It's bad enough for the healthcare system to deal with a peak down here. So spread it out, ease the burden on the healthcare system. And two, if you actually do the integration, calculus, remember? You do the integration, the area under the flattened curve is less, meaning fewer cases present. So it's a no-brainer. You want the slower peaking, longer lasting epidemic. Also because it buys you time maybe for some lucky miracle like a vaccine. Don't count on it. I don't think so. That's a separate discussion. And how do you do that? You do that by limiting the interactions between people that can transmit the virus. How often they're in crowded spaces like schools, public gatherings, aircraft, that kind of thing. It's called social distancing. That's the buzzword. You increase social distancing. And you do so through the use of measures that limit larger gatherings. To do this involves federal and provincial jurisdiction in equal part. The federal government could use the Emergencies Act and step in and do some of that. I won't go down that path. Anyway, the point is that if you manage to spread this out, you will lessen the harm and lessen the stress. So it's actually quite simple. Anyone who says it's complicated is just failing to understand it scientifically, I think. Now, the problem is, of course, that to make an intervention that matters, people have to have a common understanding. This is Colleen's point. They have to be speaking the same language, and language is terribly important here. Senator, you opened your comment by saying, I think WHO will declare a pandemic at some point. I'm afraid not. And the reason for that is WHO, in its ever accelerating slide to mediocrity and irrelevance, some years ago abolished its official definition of a quote unquote pandemic. That definition used to read, and I paraphrase, that a pandemic is person to person transmission of a disease in two WHO regions. WHO is carved up into regional offices. The Americas are one, Africa is another, Europe is another. If you've got person to person transmission in two different regions, that used to be a pandemic. Now, WHO has abolished that term, except for influenza, which makes it very confusing, because then pandemic becomes a shorthand for influenza, rather than a meaningful term about the propagation and geographic extent of the disease. WHO did abolish the term because they were always under pressure, particularly from journalists, about whether the term should be used or not. And they had exactly the wrong reaction. Rather than helping to inform journalists who served this tremendous role in informing the rest of us, they just acted to slice that word out of their mouth, cut off their tongue. Now, this is typical WHO. And the second and last point I want to make here is that WHO basically can't be trusted. And I say this having worked with them for decades. I mentioned I've been on expert committees, I've negotiated contracts for them, you name it, I've done it. I don't choose to do it anymore. And the reason I don't choose to do it anymore is because it has basically ceased being a scientific organization. And it is now much more of a political and comms organization than it was when I first became involved in the 1990s. So to give you an example, the Emergency Committee, capital E, capital C, the Emergency Committee for COVID-19 the one that decides whether there's a public health emergency of international concern or not, is shot through with conflict of interest because you've got two members on that committee from the airline industry. Can you believe it? Well, what do you think the airline industry would say anytime there's an outbreak? Would they say there's an emergency and we need to start curtailing flights? Curiously, I think they wouldn't say that. So when you have a committee that has industry like this, that has a commercial stake in the outcome, you're not doing science anymore. You're just not, right? Further, the last time I was asked to sit on that committee, I refused. The reason I refused is I was asked to sign a confidentiality agreement of the most extraordinary kind. Now I've signed, I don't know, 50 maybe confidentiality agreements in my life for this or that. Tons. I have a folder of them. And most of them say you will keep confidential information in confidence. If information is given to you of a confidential nature, you will guard that confidence and you'll do so forever. I never have a problem with that clause. That's fine. But the WHO agreement goes further and it says that deliberations of the committee, including ones submissions you make as an expert, your own words to the committee in deliberations, must never be repeated, even by yourself, without WHO's permission, and the term is enforceable in arbitration. In other words, if I went into that committee, or any expert goes in, expresses a point of view, perhaps dissents with the committee, that person is legally prohibited from coming out and speaking to others and saying, I think the committee overlooked certain things. This is totalitarian, essentially, right? And so it's because of developments like this, the excessive secrecy, the overbroad confidentiality agreement, the industry influence on the emergency committee, the refusal to call anything a pandemic anymore, indeed the abolition of the definition, that I think you can't trust WHO. You just can't trust them. And what a sad thing to say.
Thank you. Now I would like to invite Professor Jane Bailey in the Common Law section, teaching cyberfeminism, technoprudence, and contracts, and leading the Equality Project. Please.
Sorry,
Yes, sorry. I thought it was, and that's okay.
No problem.
Thank you.
So I was going to quote the WHO, but now I actually think they're credible on this. The WHO is arguing that one of the things we're witnessing is an infodemic. And I actually think that's true inside and outside the context of COVID-19, which is part of the research that I do. But so the infodemic is the spread of misinformation about the virus, obviously, in forms that are both injurious to public health long term, and in some cases presents immediate dangers to life and well-being. But equally, so for example, false claims about how to cure or treat the disease, including drinking bleach and spraying yourself with chlorine, like these kind of sort of hoax forms of disinformation that are obviously immediately dangerous to bodily harm, to the body and even present risks of death. But I think equally concerning over the long term and the short term is misinformation about the origins of the virus that are designed to foment social and political division. In much the same way as we've seen done with electoral manipulation, I think. In this case, playing on longstanding racist beliefs and practices, that some of which I think Professor Chen will talk about shortly. So we have completely unfounded claims that Chinese scientists created the virus as a bioweapon, allegations that the US created the virus to crush the Chinese economy. And these sorts of conspiracy theories both reflect and are reflective of racially charged political and social tensions and divisions between East and West. And the broad powers of dissemination of social media platforms and their own incentive structures play critical roles in this process. So just to give an example, an early on, a non-peer-reviewed preliminary report that was published online that seemed to suggest advert to a conspiracy theory was picked up in a tweet by one journalist, and that tweet then got shared thousands of times on Facebook, Twitter, Reddit, and Instagram in multiple languages. Ultimately was picked up by a well-known propaganda website called Zero Hedge, again, to fabricate a conspiracy theory that is eminently designed to create panic. And just from the Zero Hedge site alone, though their post racked up over 15,000 shares on Facebook. And all of this, even though both the study itself and the original tweet were actually withdrawn. And despite the lack of evidence to support the theory, and in the face of, amongst other things, a relatively recent Lancet statement from 27 public health scientists condemning these sorts of conspiracy theories. More recently have come suggestions that the kinds of false allegations that we're seeing don't just emanate from individuals who are trying to gather information and share it with family and friends, perhaps in misguided ways, but also from people who are actually trying to harm China's reputation, the US's reputation, others in the disinformation community whose goal it is just in general to undermine government and fact-based media. And sometimes these sorts of online fake news campaigns originate from automated sources or bots, which Ferrara describes as a computer algorithm that automatically produces content and interacts with humans on social media, trying to emulate and possibly alter their behavior. So sometimes bots are seen as helpful because they crawl news sources, for example, to produce a news feed that's designed to conform to a user's interest. Other times they're recognized as distinctly unhelpful and even malicious, such as where they're used to create fake profiles that look like they belong to human beings, in order to infiltrate other users' social media accounts and gain access to a broader group of followers. So this latter type gathers data about users to profile them and then tailors misinformation to target people who are most likely to believe it. They take advantage of human tendencies to focus on things like what appears to be popular, to trust information that's given in a social setting, and to trust our social contacts. So we're all familiar, I would think by now, with headlines about anti-vax movements and political campaigns that have used bots to shift user behavior, ideas, and even voting patterns. And it's these sort of bots that I've just been seeing recently in the media that the US is now accusing Russia of using to spread the conspiracy theory that the US is behind the virus. So I want to close off just by saying, what are the sorts of things that can be done and are being done? And they're sort of typical ways of handling and responding to problems in the communication environment. One obviously is flooding the online market with true information, or as true and as accurate information as you have. The World Health Organization has been involved, is deeply involved actually in a social media strategy and trying to leverage communication platforms and trusted channels in order to spread accurate information. Another approach is to filter out false information. So the World Health Organization and others have pressured with some degree of success social media companies like Google, Twitter, Facebook, Baidu, and Tencent to push reliable content to the top of search results and to provide top banner responses on coronavirus that direct people to links so that they can see information from their local public health authority. And I have to say in this context, this, as someone who works in the area of online hate speech, this is a really strong demonstration to me that where there's a will from social media companies to do this sort of thing, there is a way. Another approach is to simply remove false content. That obviously is controversial because who gets to be the arbiter of what is truth and false? But we have seen in this context, Facebook, for example, using fact checkers and pulling content such as those pages that are advocating drinking bleach as a cure for the disease, for example. Finally, we have bot detectors, which are programs that are designed to help platforms and with respect to certain detectors, users figure out whether a site that they're following or a Twitter account that they're following and maybe retweeting is actually a bot. It's actually something that's created fictitious rather than a human being. The problem is that because of the rapidity with which content moves and is disseminated, many of these strategies have limited effect because we find ourselves in a whack-a-mole problem. We fix it here, but it's already emanated in 16 places over here. Finally, just to end, I think it's really important that this kind of moment for us all to recognize the role that the click-for-profit model of the internet that we currently have is actually playing in all of this. This is at the base of this. If you drive popular content to the top as a mechanism for determining profitability, we end up in these kind of situations that we see ourselves in now. So this is a reflection of a much broader problem. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I want to thank the panelists for being so respectful of the times that we agreed upon. We are going to have time before we conclude. I think we're trying to end before 1 o'clock, and we will have time for some questions from the audience. If I may please now ask Professor Y.Y. Chen to speak.
Right, so Professor Flood started the panel with a discussion about quarantine and how its effectiveness as a public health tool, and some of the tension that might have with human rights protection. So I want to actually continue that theme, but this time looking at a different way that we often employ to limit the spread of disease. Right, so in addition to just limiting people, trying to confine them in a relatively small space, as we've seen as response to the current COVID-19 outbreak, we're also often seeing countries closing their borders, right? Imposing travel restrictions is another common way to deal with the spread of the infection. And we see that with respect to COVID-19 this time around, that travel restriction started by, in relation to China specifically, and now we see that as the infection spread, and we see the implementation of these kind of measures being used on other countries. And so, for example, we have some countries such as Russia and Mongolia that either partially or entirely close the borders that they have with China. And then you also have other group of countries such as the United States, New Zealand, Australia, who they didn't close their border entirely, but what they do is they ban foreign nationals who have been in China for the past 14 days before their arrival from coming into the country, right? And then you have others that have simply suspended international flights to and from China or other affected countries. So all those are what I meant by travel restrictions. And so it's quite notable that all these travel restrictions are happening in the absence of any recommendations from the World Health Organization, despite its failings, right? But it's important to know that the World Health Organization right now has not made any recommendation to halt international travel or trade as part of our response to the outbreaks, and yet all this is happening, right? And so from the perspective of international law, this renders these travel restrictions, at least some of them, legally suspect. So according to international health regulations, which I'm sure some of you are quite aware of, so first of all, these are regulations that are binding on all state parties to the World Health Assembly, the vast majority of countries around the world. And so, according to Article 43 of the regulations, any measures taken by countries in response to public health risks that go beyond the recommendations from the WHO, first of all, must be reported to the WHO if those measures significantly interfere with international travel. But more importantly, these measures need to be justified on the basis of public health rationale and scientific evidence and principles. Now, my own view is that the justifiability of these travel restrictions that we're currently seeing is questionable. For example, to the extent that travel restrictions may also impact the free flow of healthcare practitioners or supplies from going into some of these affected countries, right, who might need international assistance. In that context, I would say that travel restrictions that actually do more harm than good in terms of furthering public health objectives. But even if we take that there might be some public health utilities to these travel restrictions, I think that we need to think long and hard about the potential cost of these travel restrictions. And I'm not just talking about economic costs, which obviously are going to be quite high, but they're going to be costs on people, right? They're going to be social costs as well. And in particular, I think in our implementation of and our discourse about these travel restrictions, we need to really be mindful of the potential of stereotyping. So we need to be vigilant, right? So I think as many of you no doubt have seen in the news or on social media, right, there are reports in the wake of the COVID-19 outbreak that some individuals that are of East Asian descent or who quote unquote look Chinese, right, are facing quite a bit of racially motivated violence, ranging from outright discrimination to what we call microaggressions. Right? And so in many ways, I think travel restrictions have the potential of fueling those kind of acts. Right? So for example, when we talk about the ban of people that have traveled, foreign nationals that have traveled to the affected countries from coming into the country, well, the same thing is not applied to a citizen, right? So to the extent that citizens and foreign nationals that have been to the affected regions, in theory, should have equal exposure to the same infection, the fact that we treat them differently seems scientifically suspect. And so in that sense, I think it fuels this construction of foreigners as diseased bodies. Right? And I don't think we need to go too far to see that there's a long-standing tradition of that, right? There's all these terms like yellow pearl, brown horse, and so forth. And so what I'm saying, the point I really want to make today is that in our response to COVID-19, right, to the extent that travel restrictions fuel these kind of narratives, I think we need to be really careful about the implementation of it. We need to make sure that any kind of travel restrictions that we do impose are grounded in scientific evidence rather than just a knee-jerk response, or as Professor Buff put it, government trying to act tough, right? As if they're trying, to show they've done something.
Thank you. And our last speaker is Professor Vanessa Griffith before we move to the Q&A.
Thank you very much. So I too am going to open my remarks by quoting the WHO. So the WHO, and I think they're right about this as well, has highlighted that human resources are really the foundation to an effective outbreak or pandemic response. And so I'd like to address three questions in my short time today. The first is, why should we be concerned about healthcare professionals in COVID-19? Second is, are healthcare professionals obligated to care for patients during epidemics, pandemics, or outbreaks of these kinds of infectious diseases? And what are the responsibilities of healthcare employers, such as hospitals and governments, to those healthcare professionals who are caring with these very sick and often very highly contagious patients? So, why should we be concerned about healthcare professionals in COVID-19? Well, there's no question we've already seen that there are many reports that over 1,700 nurses have been infected by COVID-19, including 6 deaths. So there are a number of healthcare professionals who have been exposed and infected by this virus. The Journal of American Medical Association reports that roughly 30% of the cases in one of the hospitals in Wuhan are actually healthcare workers. Okay? And it's not only exposure to the virus and getting sick from the virus that has an impact on our healthcare workers. The workload demands and the result of caring for these very sick patients in very stressful situations is also taking a toll on our healthcare professionals. So it's important that we're paying attention. So my second question really is a critical one, and that is, are our healthcare professionals obligated to treat patients during these pandemics or outbreaks? There are various codes of ethics that apply to healthcare professionals, and some of them do address the requirements under these particular circumstances. So, for example, the Canadian Nurses Association Code of Ethics nicely sets out a duty that, quote, during a natural or human-made disaster, including a communicable disease outbreak, nurses have a duty to provide care using appropriate safety precautions. And they go on to provide that a duty to provide care refers to a nurse's professional obligation to provide persons receiving care with safe, competent, compassionate, and ethical care, but there may be some circumstances in which it is acceptable for a nurse to withdraw from providing care or to refuse to provide care. And other organizations, the Canadian Medical Association and others, set out these types of duties. And so while there's a broad consensus that healthcare professionals owe an ethical obligation to their patients to care for them during these pandemics or outbreaks, it's less clear what the scope of that duty is. What exactly must healthcare providers do? And this is in part, thank you, because of the duty of care is really quite dependent on the context. So, for example, a healthcare provider that is working in a high-risk setting, like an emergency department or a critical care unit, is going to owe a higher duty of care than someone, for example, who's working as a dermatologist. Okay? What's equally important to acknowledge, though, when we're thinking about this duty of care, is these competing obligations, and this really comes out of that Code of Ethics from the Canadian Nurses Association. And some of these competing obligations are concerns that a healthcare provider could infect a family member, could infect a friend, could themselves become infected. And in fact, there's been some writing in the Lancet and other journals that healthcare providers have expressed serious concerns about infecting others. And those competing obligations often fuel a desire for healthcare providers to opt out of working under these situations. So is it possible for a healthcare provider to do that? Well, the circumstances are quite narrow, and again, they're quite context specific. There is some legislation that provides that healthcare workers, under certain circumstances, can refuse to work, and those are really dependent upon factors like whether or not an employer is providing adequate protective equipment, or whether or not the task that the provider is undertaking is a part of their regular job. Is it a danger that would be a normal part of their undertaking? And so that leads me into my third and final point, and that's around the responsibilities of healthcare employers, such as hospitals and governments, to healthcare professionals who are caring for these patients. Following the SARS crisis, thank you, there's been quite a bit of discussion about the amount of support and the importance of the support that is provided to healthcare providers. And following SARS, it became quite evident, both in terms of communication, infrastructure support, equipment, that this was often lacking and not up to standards. And we've already started to hear some discussions in the Canadian media about whether or not our governments and hospitals are again up to the task. The CFNU, the Canadian Federation of Nurses Union, has highlighted that there's uneven protection for nurses across the country, with some provinces having more rigorous standards than others. And so it's really important for us to think about what those components of this duty are. I think there are two that are really important. The first is the duty to inform, ensuring that healthcare providers have the information that they need, that it's accessible, that it's up to date, and that it's accurate. For example, the Ministry of Health in Ontario has set up a website that is specific for healthcare providers to provide up to date information. And then the second, of course, is to protect and support healthcare workers. That's not just only timely provision of necessary equipment. It also includes psychological counseling and support for our healthcare providers, for other staff, for their family members. And I think, just to close, because I know I'm just about out of time, I think that healthcare organizations, employers, and governments really need to think outside the box about how they can better protect healthcare providers. So, for example, to what extent could telemedicine be used to diagnose and treat some of these highly contagious patients? You know, you can treat patients by Skype over different types of technologies that reduces the risk that infections could be spread. Under the buzzer.
I could tell you had like
Under the buzzer.
one more point, so I paused. I actually paused to give her an extra 10 seconds. Yeah. So we now open this up for discussion. My understanding is that we're going to try to bring this to a close at about 10 minutes to 1. Have I got that correct? And if I may just raise something that I'd appreciate your thoughts on, panelists and audience. One of the tasks that I did recently as a senator was respond to a group of doctors in Calgary who asked me to come and stand with them and the local Uyghur population in Alberta, raising very deep concerns about the risk that the Uyghurs are. As many of you will know, there's an estimated at least 1 million Uyghurs who have been forced into encampments. And in addition to that, the doctors also invited a Falun Gong practitioner to speak about the situation for Falun Gong practitioners. So here we've talked about close proximity, but we haven't talked about forced close proximity. So I would like to toss that out if anyone had any thoughts on that. And just one very small fact to share, that the budget of the WHO, which I did not know until this meeting last week, is actually less than most large hospitals, single hospitals. So you're talking about a budget that's just over $2 billion. And this is not to necessarily argue the concerns that have been raised, but probably we want to factor that in as well when we analyze what's happening from this world, the responsibility given to the WHO by our world. So please, may I welcome questions or comments, sir?
I wanted to follow up with
Perhaps an introduction, if you wouldn't mind, just who you are.
Stephen Binman. I'm a visiting fellow here at the Faculty of Law. Professor Adarand, if one accepts your position about the WHO, and I'm not equipped to accept or not accept, but if one accepts it, what are the consequences of not being able to trust the World Health Organization? So, like, take us one step further along the line, like, so where does that leave us?
It leaves you exactly where you are right now. I mean, I don't want to be glib, but you know, in this pandemic, if you prefer, and I do prefer, we are in a tough spot because we have dealt thus far mainly with two institutions that do not communicate well, and that is putting it politely. One is the government of China, which suppressed information about the emergence of the infection for quite some time, and even took the extraordinary measures of arresting doctors who tried to warn about it. You can't trust the Chinese. You can't trust their statistics on this, right? Because they're not motivated. That government is not motivated by a desire to present unvarnished scientific truth. They've changed the way they count and report cases numerous times. Most of what they report is not reported in a manner that we would consider up to the data standards of peer-reviewed publication. They're just not transparent. And that's true of China and many things, so this is no surprise. But the WHO as well. You know, what happens in the emergency committee that declared a public health emergency of international concern, most would say it declared it a couple weeks too late. Those are secret deliberations. And the people who participate in them are under a gag order, effectively, that they've signed away their right to even disclose their own contributions to the deliberations, never mind somebody else's, on pain of being dragged into international arbitration. So we are in a, how can I put it, informationally deprived environment. But it is because of the institutions themselves.
But
Perhaps if we can come back around.
I'm Villani Gapte, the School of Political Studies at this university. Thank you very much for your comments, and I really appreciate it. And I have to say that unfortunately I will have to add to what my colleague Ataran just said about the WHO and its limitation. I mean, this is an organization that's meant to be universal, and it excludes a country of 73 million people that stand at the front line of that emergency. And I think, to go back to the intervention of my colleague here, yes, we can do something. We can certainly, our governments could promote the inclusion of Taiwan in the World Health Organization.
Thank you.
Another
Is
question?
anyone from this side of the room?
Yeah, I have a question here.
We'll come back.
I guess, thank you. To follow up a bit on Professor Rubin's points, I'm just kind of wondering how should our public health units be approaching information sharing with frontline workers in pandemic type situations? I'm just thinking of an instance, I don't quite remember the entire circumstances, but I believe that Toronto paramedics transported a presumed COVID patient, and it was through Toronto Public Health posting on social media that they became aware of it. So, like, how should
the
we
wrong
approach
way.
it?
I think we can all agree that's not what we want to do. Well, I think there's a couple of ways that this can be done. I think the starting principle has to be that our public health officials have to be open and transparent about this information. And provide accurate and up-to-date information. Going back to the SARS crisis, this was a real problem, and I think it created a lot of distrust by healthcare workers in the system and really fueled these concerns about whether they should be going to work or not. And I must say, you know, most healthcare professionals during SARS went over and above in terms of delivering healthcare services, but there were major concerns about information. So then the second thing is, well, not through social media, but ensuring that there are systems set up so that healthcare providers are given the information that they need and that is relevant to them in a timely way. And so a few of the speakers have referred to the importance of information and managing that during a pandemic or an outbreak. That's equally important when we're thinking about the flow of information to healthcare providers and to people who have been potentially exposed to the disease. So,
Question, please.
Yes, my name is Isaac Nahon. I'm from the Department of Communication, and this morning I was teaching a risk and crisis communication seminar, and we did an exercise at the end where I asked my students to provide 3 recommendations to the general public on how to responsibly use social media in relationship to the COVID-19 situation. And most of them talk about, telling people about consulting trusted sources. But since you are saying that you cannot trust WHO, then who will be a trusted source in this case?
Look, it's a problem. You know, I can't say that this is a situation of don't drink Coke, drink Pepsi, that there's a ready alternative. There isn't. But let me tell you a story about WHO. Years and years ago when I worked on HIV/AIDS policy, this is going back to about the year 2000, we were always baffled by India's statistics on AIDS. Because while I don't remember the figures exactly, they were somewhat like this. In 1 year, India had 3.9 million HIV infected people. In the next year, they had 3.95. In the next year, they had 3.97. And these were official WHO statistics on India. And anyone looking at that knows this is bullshit. You know, epidemics don't go asymptotically up to 4 million. And when I asked, because I was working a lot with WHO in those days, I asked the data people at WHO, why is this? This makes no sense. The answer they gave me was to laugh at my naivete and say, don't you know countries have to approve the statistics we publish for them? And India doesn't want it to look like 4 million. That's the way it works. You know, and so if you want accurate statistics, you may or may not get them from WHO. It depends on whether the government in question is exerting that kind of influence. If it's not, perhaps the number is good. If it is, the number is likely rubbish.
I do just want to share an observation that so far, and they've been very good questions, and we're very grateful for them, all the questioners have been men. So if I may encourage, do we have any questions from anyone else that would like to ask a question?
I had a question for more to social media. How would you go about managing those false information? Because I know from a younger point of view, I know a lot of my friends, maybe not in the science field, have asked a question about, okay, what is this and this? So yeah, I'll go on your point. How would you do that?
Yeah. So part of it, I guess there's two ways of responding. Often the advice that gets handed out is about, well, you as an individual need to be sort of more critical and literate and thinking about what the source of information is in particular before you share it and sort of re-disseminate. And so, you know, that is part of it. I acknowledge that. But I do think we have to go back, and this is just part of a broader discussion about what the responsibility of the platforms are in terms of the dissemination of false information or information that is actually designed to sway people to do things that they otherwise wouldn't do. And so I think I see this as part of that broader discussion. So I think people need to get more engaged in that conversation as policymakers are looking at what's the role of social media platforms in all of this? What's the role of government? If there's a role for regulation, what does regulation look like? I think the increasing demand for accountability from platforms is a really important one. And as I said earlier, I actually think that what sort of just looking over a few days, I'm actually not on Instagram or Facebook, so my research assistant looks on Instagram and Facebook for me, and she was quite surprised. She really expected to see a lot of problematic memes, for example, and she really didn't. Like you really actually had to dig quite low in search results to come up with these, which tells me. You know, and again, I'm sort of not voting for corporations to suppress free speech. That's obviously the other problem here. But if there's, to the extent there's any claim, well, this is not really something we can do, that actually isn't really accurate. So from a policy perspective, I think those are all just important things to keep in mind. Yeah.
Shall we take one more question? And then I know folks have to head to class and whatnot. Yes, please.
Hi, I'm Nina. Anyway, my question is about to everybody in the panel in terms of when I listen to the news, each time they start, I mean, at least I listen to, for example, the French news conference, it is it has not been declared a pandemic yet. And this is always like the opening statement. And having heard now that this definition is no longer relevant, like how come that people at different levels, journalists and so on, are so believing and continuing to vehiculate those statements and those definitions that are empty?
And
I
who
think it- I
cares
think-
what you call it? It's like
That's right.
it's like
That's
the
right.
election coverage, and it's the horse. Like, who cares that we're in 3 days we're going to call it a pandemic? Like, what different? Sorry, I'm just following up. But what, like,
Well,
what's
but precisely, if you know what it means, you can say, okay, we have crossed a certain level. And because I know people who also say, oh, and actually in different countries, Poland, because with the regime, they protect everything. They say, oh, it's nothing wrong, no problem with coronavirus. You know, this is what they say in Poland. My friends say that. There is nothing to worry about. But okay, so going back to the definition, it means to me, in my mind, if we knew a definition, it means we've crossed a certain level of dangerosity. That's all. Intuitively, this is what I would mean. And what that level would be, this is the question.
Maybe we're just investing a little bit too much in a word, right? Like like that. Do we have to be concerned? Depends on this label. Maybe sort of is kind of beside the point. And in a way, I don't know. I can't speak for media, but I assume part of what media is doing is trying to be responsible and not inflame panic. If that is not, right? And so I think part of the pandemic word and not using the pandemic word is part of trying to keep people from panicking. But I think what we really need to be thinking about and be prepared for is once the pandemic word is used, like panic is actually not going to help anything anyway, pandemic or not.
I'm going to ask for one last response, and then we will adjourn.
I have to disagree with Jane on this. We are not investing too much meaning in the word. The word has been invested with a lot of meaning since forever.
But before most of us heard you today, we didn't even know what that definition was, yet we were sitting on the edge of our seat saying, oh, is it going to be declared a pandemic? But we didn't even know what it meant.
But the fact that we are sitting on the edge of our seats for that word means it actually has some significance, or we would be lounging in bed and drinking a beer. But we're instead on the edge of our seats. And so I think you're right. I think it's been incredibly unhelpful that this highly meaningful word, we can debate whether it should be meaningful or not, but it is meaningful, has been divested of a normative meaning by WHO. And the reason they did it, I mean, as told to me by Donald McNeil, the global health reporter for the New York Times, he says, basically, I'm to blame. He said, in the 2009 influenza epidemic, I hectored and badgered WHO to say, is it or isn't it a pandemic? And they responded by killing the word. And this to me is very unhelpful, because if you go back to what I said at the beginning, the job is to take this kind of epidemic curve into that kind. And anything right now that seizes the imagination of people and gets them prepared to accept the hard work that is to come in this transition is helpful and oughtn't to be sacrificed on the linguistic altar, as has happened.
Thank you. Thank you to everyone for your careful attention as an audience. And take care out in that snow.
Dangerous.